So with the latest balanced data slate, Tyranid Carnifexes and Screamer Killers got some rather nice buffs. Let's take a look at the units and their points drops, talk about what they can do on the tabletop, and how effective they're looking for the points cost right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids and specifically Carnifexes, having a look at the two buff datasheets that came out of the balanced data slate, both of which I think are looking far more interesting than they were previously. In the video, let's talk briefly about their lore and models, go through their datasheet and a couple of the more obvious buffs and synergies from Codex Tyranids, and roughly where I think they stand right now versus the competition. As Tyranid beasts go, the Carnifexes are perhaps one of their most iconic monsters, maybe alongside the Hive Tyrant perhaps. These are basically frontline Tyranid living battering rams, pretty terrifying and brutal medium-sized monsters, not the very biggest organisms that the Tyranids can send into battle, but still a fairly terrifying shock assault threat. Armour thick enough that you're not going to bring them down with small arms, and capable of both tearing apart the enemy at close range with claws and talons, or being equipped with ranged biomorphs if that should be what the situation calls for. They're well known to excel in thunderous charges, often being in the front line of the Tyranid forces, though aren't exactly the most sophisticated of the hive mind's creations. If they're cut off from synaptic control, they're likely to go berserk and just run rampage wildly. Out of the Tyranids' forces, the Carnifexes are maybe one of the organisms that gets varied the most in terms of adaptations. They can be specced for range and melee, and have additional augmentations such as bioplasma or spine banks, and are well known to have some more major variations such as the Screamer Killer with its soul-shredding shriek, or the Armoured Thornback or Brutal Stone Crusher. For their miniatures in the Tyranid range at the moment, the standard Carnifexes are sold in sets of 2 for £65 or $106 from Games Workshop. They're online only, so you don't get as much discount from the discount retailers that do reduce them a bit. They're a kit with really quite a lot of options between their Crushing Claws, Scything Talons and ranged biomorphs, and they also have some different head swaps as well, one of which is used to represent Old One Eye and its regeneration these days. They also have the slightly dubious honour of being the oldest models in the Tyranid range, the kit coming out from 2005. There's just the Tyranid Warrior set that's older than that, and I believe that had some sprues added in later as well. And as a result, maybe there's a slight possibility that they might be one of the ones that's a bit more likely to get redone than others at some stage. Probably not to the point that I'd really hold my breath for it, but I can imagine there'd be a popular one to redo. In 10th edition, we also had a specific release for the Screamer Killer, a modern take on the rather trippy beastie that is the classic model on the top right. He was fairly well received with his great big long scything talons and a fairly fun and brutish looking Tyranid muscle monster. He had a good appearance carving through some space marines in the Leviathan trailer, though was unfortunately laid low by the Ballistus Dreadnought. Currently he's only sold in the Horrors of the Hive set on the sprue alongside the Neuro Tyrant. If looking to pick up either of those, the online-only status of them does mean that discount retailers don't have them off quite as much. Wargame Portal in the USA has them at 5% discounted, Taschengelddieb in Germany and the EU has 6%, plus you might get a bit of store credit alongside those. Taschengelddieb did give me a referral code in the video description. If you did want to pick them up through any of these links, it does mean that relative to the other units in the army, they can be a bit more expensive. Thanks to anyone for using the discount links in the video description who was picking them up though. Given they feel like relatively central monsters that are supposed to be some of the mainstay Tyranid battle line units, in 10th edition they feel like they've been weirdly lower mid in competitive play, lots of other strong monstrous rivals tending to have the spotlight rather than them. For a review of their use in competitive play recently, I took a look at 50 top placing Tyranids list, ones going 4-1 undefeated or better. It seems that 6 of those lists chose to use Screamer Killers, often 1 or 2 of them, and mostly subterranean assault there. 3 of them used Carnifexes, generally in pairs alongside Old One Eye, and just 1 of them used Old One Eye solo. They were widely regarded as some of the Tyranid monstrous creatures that were really quite in need of a buff, and Games Workshop does seem to have delivered that in the balanced data slate, with both the Screamer Killer and the Carnifexes going down in points, the Screamer Killer by a bit, and Carnifexes by a lot. For the Carnifexes, previously there were 115 points per model, and you can field them in squads of either 1 or 2, so it was 230 for 3. Now they're 90 points for 1 of them and 180 points for 2, and that's really quite a big relative points decrease. They're cut by 25 points per model, a great big 28% drop if you were fielding them by themselves, though admittedly very few people really were. It does kind of indicate just how badly they were priced though, if you can give them a decrease by quite this much and they're still not looking overpowered or anything. In reality, for the few lists that were taking them, as mentioned, they more often tend to be fielded as a pair alongside Old One Eye. He's 150 points, so if you're looking at the improvement for that unit, they're more improved by about 13% or so, dropping down from 380 points for the squad of them down to 330. That's still a decent improvement on something that was seeing niche play, and isn't taking up quite such an enormous portion of a list. Before we talk through Carnifex datasheets, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor and ObjectiveMarkers.com. As the name would suggest, they're makers of 40k objective markers, based in the UK, though shipped to plenty of places around the world, and a link down in the video description. Objective markers are pretty common 40k battlefield accessories. You basically have a circular disc with a 40mm central objective marker marked out in the middle, then a 3-inch scoring zone around that. Their particular take on them has them made of clear flexible silicon mats, so you can see the battlefield through them pretty easily. They're pretty thin so as not to disturb models being placed on them, and the designs on them aim to add a bit of faction-specific theme. Speaking of which, they do have ones that could represent the swarms from beyond the galaxy, generally sold at £30 or $42 for the 6 of them. They've got a channel merch design with an Auspex feel, could be a nice enough faction agnostic one there. Any sales of that one help support the channel a little. And then beyond that, they've got really quite a lot of different designs for different factions out there, ones that could represent Chaos Greenskins, various flavours of power armour, and some newer designs for some Space Elves or Battle Sisters. Check out the stuff linked down in the video description. They do have some other things like these terrain bases, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Let's take a look at some Carnifex stat lines though, and for your 90 points now, you get 8 wounds at toughness 9 with a 2+ save, and that feels like a much more acceptable ratio than the big 115 points they were paying for that before. Basically a profile that's going to be really resistant to any sort of small arms, but big things like las cannons with high AP and damage, and melter weapons with their strength of 9 are going to pose quite a big threat to these. With their 2+ save, if you can get them cover, then that's all well and good. They'll value it more than most things in the army. The 8-inch move does feel like a bit of a weakness. Most of the time they're going to want to be getting in melee, and a lot of the time that's going to mean that they're not moving forward all that very fast, particularly if they're going to be trying to move around ruins and things, something that the subterranean assault can potentially help with. And then for objective control, they've got 3 apiece, they're only leadership 8, so quite likely to fail any battle shock tests they might have. That could be a weakness for them against certain enemy units, though if you're taking either 2 or 3 of them, which you often are, they can actually never be below half strength and have to test battle shock normally. If 1 gets taken down, then you've still got 2, so above half strength, and if 2 get killed, then the last one is Old One-Eye, who basically counts as his own unit once again. For weapons, it is maybe a bit of a feels bad that the Carnifexes only hit on a 4+. Given a new lower points cost, it's not the end of the world, though it maybe does feel a bit odd that they went for this, given that the vast majority of other Tyranid monstrous creatures hit on a 3 now. Provided the price for the damage that they do output, though, it's not necessarily killer. It can just mean that they'll be a bit more susceptible to things like enemy modifiers such as stealth. For their secondary weapons, basically every Carnifex can take a bioplasma attack and some spine banks for free. 2 flavours of damage 1 small arm. The bioplasma has some assault and blast shots, the spine banks, a bunch of strength 5 and AP 0, though only at 6-inch range. They feel handy enough for a bit of chip damage, but you probably don't want to be making your charge longer with these if that's going to be a factor. For their more mainstream weapons, you have a pretty vast array of choice. 4 different ranged guns, several of which you can double up on, but not the Venom Cannon or the Stranglethorn Cannon, and then 2 different primary melee attacks with Crushing Claws or Scything Talons. If you don't take either of those, you just get a bunch of strength 6 and damage 1. And if you want to double down on melee, you can take the extra Scything Talons, which gives you 2 more attacks at strength 9 and damage 3. Looking back at all the Carnifexes people have been fielding since the Tyranid Codex came out, the ones that tend to get the most play are the Crushing Claws for the melee attacks. They're 4 attacks at strength 12, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 1. Quite nice to be hitting with sort of pseudo las cannon attacks there. At least you know they're going to be really quite a big threat to tough stuff out there, even if they won't kill too many hordes. Those are most commonly paired with a heavy venom cannon for the ranged weapon, with D3 shots at 36 inches, strength 9, AP 2 and damage 3. A profile that's not likely to be standout against any one thing, though should at least be a threat against most stuff. And then otherwise, both the Despotters and Devourers can get some interest, particularly as you can double up on them. If you wanted to do a Carnifex style build, I've seen at least a few people using Despotters with their Slimer Maggots. That gets you a 12-shot Carnifex with strength 7, AP 2 and damage 1. So basically really quite nice at stacking a bunch of alright saves against infantry, that they're not going to be too standout against anything that's got multi-wounds. Potentially with a pair of those backing up Old One-Eye, you do get a fairly well-rounded unit though. 24 shots of that profile, plus maybe some more from the bioplasma and spine banks, and the unit can still handle itself in melee well enough between the incidental Carnifex attacks and Old One-Eye's powerful hits. Finally, for their special rule, they've got the Blistering Assault, basically a surge move where if they get shots, they get to move D6 plus 2 inches towards the enemy, and you can activate that if one of the models lost at least 1 wound from those attacks. This one can make up for that low movement a little bit, potentially if they're on a mid-board objective and the opponent moves up to try and contest that from them, they could jump into melee. That could make the opponent think twice about how they approach these guys or whether it's even worth contesting an objective against them. though bear in mind that jumping into melee isn't going to necessarily stop them from getting shot further, but you would get the -1 to hit from big guns never tire functioning. It is a fairly handy and disruptive special rule though when it functions. It could be useful if the opponent was queued up to charge you as well, as if you jump into melee with them, then you're going to have the chance to activate first most of the time. Then while we're talking Carnifexes, let's mention Old One Eye. He's 150 points, and even with their lower points cost, still seems well worth it to be able to have them landing those hits with far more accuracy. His biggest benefit is that the entire unit gets 2 reroll hit rolls, so all those Carnifexes hitting on a 4+ won't be feeling quite so bad or missing quite so much, and that applies to him as well with his weapon skill 3+ attacks too. Points per wound is roughly as durable as the rest of the Carnifexes now. He gets 1 extra wound and a 5+ feel no pain. And due to the 5+ feel no pain, effectively meaning that you're going to have to take a lot more saves against him, he's now around about the same durability as the rest of his unit, rather than being a bit tougher per point. He does also have a regeneration ability that has D3 wounds restored if he's not slain at the start of each player's command phase. Quite fun to have him regenerating in the enemy turn as well. And in melee, he's particularly stand out against big tough enemy monsters and vehicles. 6 attacks at strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6+1, and while he's got a Carnifex left to lead, they'll be all re-rolling those hits. He can trade into sweep attacks if it makes sense against the right targets. Being a character in the unit is also kind of fun as well, as it means that you can use Epic Challenge if you'd like. He's got a pretty reasonable chance of sniping out an enemy character with all those big hitting damage D6+1 attacks. For your 330 points, if the entire unit gets to activate with shooting and fighting, here's roughly how much damage that you might expect. This one's for Old One Eye leading to Venom Cannon and Crushing Claw Carnifexes, though you could do other builds, and this is with no other buffs from any detachments or other units, so they're not having any sustained or lethal hits from Invasion Fleet for example. For the shooting, their Venom Cannons will take a few chunks out of some medium infantry. I've counted the Bioplasma here and sort of half the spine banks to represent they might not all be in range. You may be looking at killing a couple of Space Marines or 1 or 2 Terminators perhaps, but not doing very much against monsters and vehicles due to the strength 9. In melee though, it kind of flips around. You're still going to be doing enough damage to hordes to make their presence felt. Old One Eye does have his sweep attacks, even if the regular Carnifexes aren't going to do too much with their low attacks. They kill around about 8 Space Marines, 4 Terminators, which their invulnerable saves are fairly strong against these, but their real specialty is going into big tough multi-wound targets. Against a toughness 10 tank with a 3+ save, you should be killing just about anything in the game if they all get to swing. With the entire unit, you do about 28 wounds to a toughness 10 or 11 vehicle there. That should be a good chance to one round a Imperial or Chaos Knight, or around about 19 wounds to a Land Raider, though admittedly things like Armour of Contempt could reduce that a bit. Overall, you do pay a lot of points at 330, but they're really quite dangerous and particularly into heavy targets. For the other Carnifex, the Screamer Killer's 125 points now, so he's down from 135 and an 8% drop there. Not absolutely enormous, but not nothing as well. And as we saw from the competitive list, it does look like he's making his way into a few more lists at the moment anyway. For the 125 points, he's not quite as durable as the regular Carnifexes are per point. He has the same toughness 9 profile and 10 wounds at that, but per point it means that the regular Fexes are around about 10% tougher, and otherwise has a fairly similar stat line with that similar 8-inch move. For his damage output, he gets a Bioplasmic Scream to melt a few 1-wound infantry, D6+3 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1, that only hits on a 4+, perhaps a bit more incidental damage there, or horde clearance, or being able to hand out his special rule. His melee profile's by far the scarier. 10 attacks hitting at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3 is a pretty perfect profile for killing certain 3-wound enemy elites. It's really quite nice into Terminators or other similar equivalents, and he is quite a general purpose threat with that stat line. It's only really toughness 11 and 12 vehicles that are going to be a bit safer from all that volume attacks, but even then there's a pretty reasonable chance he sneaks a wound or 2 through. For his damage output, this is combining his shooting and then fighting. If he gets to do that unrestricted, it's around about 9 Guardsmen or Termagants, about 5 enemy Space Marines or 3 Terminators. He's still pretty solid into toughness 10 vehicles with around 8 wounds to a Gladiator tank, but falls down a bit versus the really tough targets. Compared with the Carnifexes and Old One Eye, he's just lots more efficient into the Space Marine Terminator and Horde style targets, but per point just isn't really quite as good as them into really tough stuff. Then finally we have his special rule, which is a Death Scream to force a battle shock test on something that he attacked with his Scream attack. That's always going to be a bit variable and the opponent just might always pass, but if it does go through, you could maybe turn off certain defensive stratagems from time to time, which could be really big. And it's potentially quite interesting to pair with a Neurolictor, as if you manage to battle shock an enemy which is a little bit more reliable with him, then you could be getting a +1 to wound into that target. That's going to help him out quite a lot into tough stuff, or could light the way for some Tyranid shooting. Overall, they're both interesting datasheets, it's just whether or not the points cost is really enough to justify the overall offering. If we're trying to get a bit more out of them, there's quite a lot that could help out the Carnifexes in various ways, though I wouldn't really say that any of this is actually necessary, just more sort of nice things to have and might work in the right army and detachment. Synapse could be nice enough in melee, the +1 strength wouldn't be too helpful to the regular Carnifexes, at least if they're taking crushing claws, but for the Screamer Killer, going to strength 11 could be good against certain tough tanks and vehicles. As mentioned, the Neurolictor works rather well with the Screamer Killer. If you've got a Hive Tyrant somewhere nearby, then discount stratagems could be particularly efficient for the old one-eye block. Using a 1 command point stratagem on a big 330 point unit is likely to go a bit further compared with using it on other stuff. A Psychophage could help out the melee of either of these. Both Carnifex variants have AP-2 base attacks, and getting that to AP3 could be really big against certain 2+ armor saves out there, perhaps things like Victrix Guard or Enemy Dreadnoughts. Belenthropes could give you some more reliable cover, perhaps that could be a little more tempting if you were thinking about using the old one-eye unit block and marching them up the board. But bear in mind that cover isn't exactly the hardest thing to get in 10th edition, and you might often be able to get it anyway by putting a claw or something behind a building. Overall, most of these feel like they could be nice options, but really depend on what else is going on in the list. Out of any of them, it feels like perhaps the Neurolictor plus Screamer Killer is one of the stronger synergies. If you've got a bunch of Screamer Killers wandering around, you do genuinely have some better chances of activating a +1 to wound when you really want it. For detachment buffs for these guys, given they really want to be getting their way into close combat as fast as possible, the Subterranean Assault feels like the best detachment for them. Raveners or Trigons can deliver them into melee with an easy 6-inch charge, and maybe feels like an even bigger deal for them given that they're slowish monstrous creatures with an 8-inch move being the main way that they can get into melee, and otherwise are almost certainly going to be taking some enemy heavy firepower before they get there. Perhaps the sustained hits and ignores cover stratagem could be quite a nice one for Carnifexes as well. If going with that build, you could have some fairly hefty anti-horde with old one eye giving you reroll hits on that unit. The reroll ones to hit certainly doesn't hurt for the Screamer Killer either. Otherwise, Invasion Fleet supports most things Tyranids. The detachment buffs for either lethal hits or sustained hits are often going to be helpful. That's slightly more of a whole army decision, though you could flex into them as you need them for a command point, particularly for an old one-eye unit. The 5+ Feel No Pain seems like a really easy use for an old one-eye led Carnifex unit as well, making that extra 16 wounds worth of Carnifexes extra hard to take down. And they've also got some nice stratagems for fighting on death on a 4+ and getting critical hits on a 5+. Then finally the Crusher Stampede feels like the other one that's most standout, getting some extra OC and maybe a +1 to hit, which could be very nice for either unit when they're damaged a little. And beyond that, just having some nice support for monsters with things like tank shock stratagems and the one to smash through terrain, which again will be a really big deal for them, and you could certainly justify it on an old one-eye unit if you're hiding out of line of sight behind a ruin and then just burst straight out of it and into the midboard. Some of the others could be helpful as well. The Assimilation Swarm could heal them a bit, and Synaptic Nexus does have a fair bit of melee support as well. If you could pair them with a Synaptic Beastie, maybe a Neurolictor, Maleceptor or Norn Emissary accompanying them up into the midboard. For rivals, they do feel like they've got rather a lot going in Codex Tyranids at the moment. Perhaps the biggest and most clear one might be Screamer Killer versus Harsupex, both of which are broadly melee beasts at 125 points now, very direct competitors for the same role. There's nothing really quite like the old one-eye Carnifex block. That maybe feels like the biggest and clearest rival for that might be the Norn Emissary, not a million miles below them in terms of points investment, and also really quite a big chunky threat that can sit on a mid-board objective and cause the opponent problems trying to deal with it. For the Harsupex comparison, here's the rough damage output for the Screamer Killer. If you compare the Haruspex's numbers to it, with the vast amount of attacks, it does compare really quite similarly to the Carnifex's range plus melee, killing around about 9 or so Guardsmen or Termagants, about 5 Space Marines, and then otherwise the Haruspex is a bit stronger against the tanks and vehicles, about 9 wounds to a Gladiator tank or 6 wounds to a Land Raider, though the Screamer Killer outperforms a fair bit against 3 wound targets like Terminators. I would do quite well against other medium toughness targets, say 7 to 9. For the defensive profiles, I'd probably give a close win to the Haruspex there. 14 wounds at toughness 11 and a 3+ save, I think is overall a bit better versus 10 wounds, toughness 9 and a 2+ save. That would depend on whether you've got cover and things and what's attacking you. Against things that are AP 0 or effective AP 1, maybe with a cover save, the Screamer Killer is very likely to be kind of the similar toughness or better. Overall, for numbers alone, I'd probably give the slight win to the Haruspex. That's really borderline to the point of not really being all that important a comparison. Both of these seem really quite usable at the moment, and the Screamer Killer does have some other selling features like its special rule, and not having quite such a big base, so you might be able to fit it in places a bit better. Overall, first impressions post-point update, the Screamer Killer feels like it rivals the other monstrous creatures really quite a lot better than it did. I still don't think it's got to the point where it stands out, though also doesn't really feel like it's being left behind by the Harsupex or others quite so much. For the Carnifexes, I'd still be overall tempted to fill them with Old One Eye as opposed to running more of them separately. If you do go for the Old One Eye block, then it's going to be a big commitment, but also a big problem for the opponent to deal with. Lots of toughness and muscle, all very efficient for stratagems or 6-inch deep strike delivery, and then could be irritating to think around in the enemy turn with the potential to do those surge moves. I'm going to guess that we'll see a fair few more of them on the table after these points updates. They still feel more like solidly usable than it truly stand out to me at first impressions. I wouldn't expect them to be auto-include or anything like that, but overall I think it's a big win for them. Games Workshop giving some meaningful points cuts to make some overshadowed Tyranid datasheets a fair bit more interesting versus their rivals. Let me know your thoughts on the Carnifexes down in the comments below, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming just about every day. Thanks to Objective Markers for sponsoring this one. You can check them out, links down in the video description. They've got plenty of designs, including ones that could be good for your swarms from beyond the galaxy. And finally, if you'd like to help support Auspex Tactics, the channel does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.